The rich man's name was John, and he had just had a baby boy named David. John was overjoyed at the arrival of his son, and he immediately began showering him with love and attention. He was determined to give David the best life possible, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make sure his son was happy and healthy. For the first 3 years of David's life, John was a doting father. He spent all of his time with his son, teaching him new things and watching him grow and learn. John was constantly amazed at how quickly David was developing, and he was proud of all of the milestones his son had achieved. One day, John made a terrible mistake. He had been so busy with work that he had forgotten to lock the front door of his mansion when he left for the day. When he returned home that evening, he was shocked to find that the door was wide open and David was nowhere to be found. Panicked, John searched the entire house, calling out for his son, but there was no sign of David anywhere. John's heart sank as he realized that his son must have wandered out of the house when the door was open. John immediately called the police and reported his son missing. He spent the entire night pacing back and forth, praying that David would be found safe and sound. John was devastated when he couldn't find David, and he fell into a deep depression. He stopped going to work and spent all of his time searching for his son, but no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find any trace of him. As the months went by, John's health started to deteriorate. He wasn't eating or sleeping properly, and he was constantly stressed and anxious. He started getting sick more often, and he found it difficult to concentrate on anything. As John's health declined, so did his wealth. He was no longer able to work, and he began to lose all of his money. He was forced to sell his mansion and move into a small, rundown apartment. Despite his best efforts, John couldn't seem to get his life back on track. He was constantly struggling to make ends meet, and he was barely able to afford the basic necessities of life. One day, John received some terrible news. He had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and he was told that he only had a few months left to live. John was devastated by the news, and he began to lose all hope. He had already lost his son and his wealth, and now he was going to lose his life as well. As the weeks went by, John's condition worsened. He became too weak to work, and he was forced to rely on the kindness of strangers to survive. He was eventually forced to live on the streets, where he spent his final days alone and penniless. Despite all of his hardships, John never gave up hope of finding his son. He spent every waking moment searching for David, hoping that he would one day be reunited with his beloved son. It had been over 20 years since John had lost his son, David. He had spent the majority of those years living on the streets, struggling to survive and never giving up hope of finding his child. One day, John was sitting on the side of the road, asking for spare change from passersby, when he noticed a young boy rummaging through a trash bin nearby. John's heart skipped a beat when he saw the boy, and he couldn't believe his eyes. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about the boy. John approached the boy cautiously and asked if he was okay. The boy looked up at him and shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know where my parents are," he said, his voice shaking with fear and sadness. John's heart broke at the sight of the lost and alone child. He couldn't bear the thought of anyone being left to fend for themselves in such a cruel world. Without hesitation, he reached out and offered the boy his hand. "Come with me," he said gently. "I'll take care of you." The boy hesitated for a moment, but then he took John's hand and allowed himself to be led away. As they walked, John couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen this boy before. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something about the boy that was familiar to him. As they reached John's makeshift home, a small cardboard box under a bridge, John sat the boy down and began to tell him about his own life. He told the boy about how he had once been a rich man with a beautiful family, but how he had lost everything and ended up living on the streets. As he spoke, John watched the boy's face intently, searching for any sign of recognition. And then it hit him like a bolt of lightning. The boy's eyes, the shape of his nose, the way he tilted his head when he was listening. John was certain this was his son David. Tears sprang to John's eyes as he reached out and took the boy's hand in his own. "David," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "it's me, your father. I've been looking for you for so long." David looked at John in shock, and then a dawning realization crossed his face. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, my son, it's me. I never gave up hope of finding you, and now here you are, safe and sound." The two of them sat together, lost in their own thoughts, until the sun began to set. They had a lot of catching up to do, but for now, all that mattered was that they were together again. John was overjoyed to have finally found his son, and he was determined to do everything in his power to make up for the years they had lost. He took David in and cared for him as if he were a newborn, showering him with love and attention. As the weeks went by, John's health began to improve. The joy of being reunited with his son had given him a new lease on life, and he was filled with a sense of purpose that he had not felt in years. John worked hard to get back on his feet, and with David by his side, he was able to rebuild his life. He started a small business and worked tirelessly to make it a success. As the years passed, John and David became closer than ever. They spent all of their time together, and John was grateful every day for the second chance he had been given. In the end, John's life had come full circle. He had lost everything, but he had found his way back to the top, and he had his beloved son by his side. It was a happy ending that John never could have imagined, but one that he would always be grateful for.